And no contact triggers the avoidant's deepest fears. We often think that pulling away from someone who is emotionally distant will only push them further. But what if I told you that silence is the very thing that disrupts their entire defense system? Let's talk about avoidant attachment, that hot and cold behavior that leaves you guessing, doubting, and eventually feeling like you're asking for too much when you're simply asking for love. Now here's the twist. When you go no contact, especially after trying to connect and being met with resistance or detachment, it doesn't just give them space. It subtly but powerfully taps into their deepest fear. That fear is abandonment masked as independence. You see, avoidants don't run because they don't care. They run because intimacy feels unsafe. The closer you get, the more exposed they feel. And when they feel exposed, they shut down. Not because you're doing something wrong, but because they haven't learned how to stay when things get real. So what happens when you stop chasing, when you don't text, don't call, and don't try to fix it? It creates emotional silence, and that silence becomes a mirror. Suddenly, without your presence, without your validation, without your emotional labor, holding everything together, they're forced to feel their own discomfort. That unresolved fear they keep running from, it comes up loud. They thought they needed space, but now they feel your absence. Here's the truth. No contact doesn't win someone back. It's not a game. It's clarity. It gives both of you the space to reveal what's real. If they come back, it won't be because you begged, it'll be because your silence reminded them of what connection actually meant. Avoidants fear intimacy. Not because they don't care, but because closeness makes them feel vulnerable. This is one of the most misunderstood aspects of avoidant attachment. From the outside, it often looks like they're uninterested, aloof, or even cold. But the truth underneath is much more complex. Avoidantly attached individuals do want connection. They crave love like everyone else. But somewhere along the way, often in childhood or in formative relationships, they learn that closeness equals danger. Intimacy became associated not with warmth and safety, but with expectations, pressure, or the risk of being emotionally overwhelmed. So to protect themselves, they pull away. This fear of intimacy isn't a conscious decision most of the time. It's more like an emotional reflex. The moment things get too close, when someone starts to matter too much, when the relationship begins to deepen, the avoidant instinctively withdraws. They might cancel plans. They may become harder to reach. They suddenly get busy. It's not that they've stopped liking you, it's that their nervous system is going into self-protection mode. Deep inside, the fear is that if they open up, they'll either be engulfed, controlled, or ultimately abandoned. Ironically, the very connection they long for is what they feel most unsafe receiving. This creates a frustrating dynamic for the person on the other side. You feel like you're being punished for loving them. The more emotionally available you are, the more they retreat. And it's incredibly easy to internalize this, to start believing you're too needy or too much. But the truth is, their withdrawal says more about their past than it does about your worth. In fact, their retreat often signals that you've reached a depth they weren't prepared to handle. It's important to understand that avoidants are often not trying to hurt you. They don't always even realize what they're doing. Their behavior is a subconscious attempt to regulate fear. And ironically, the more they care, the more fear they feel. That's why you might notice them acting more distant right after a deeply intimate moment. It's not because the moment didn't mean anything. It's because it meant too much. Avoidants have developed a story that independence is safer than connection. They prize autonomy to a fault. But underneath that self-sufficiency is a deep, often unacknowledged fear. If I let someone in, I'll lose myself or get hurt. So they hold love at arm's length, trying to manage it rather than experience it fully. Recognizing this doesn't excuse the behavior, but it does help you stop taking it personally. It helps you stop fighting to prove yourself to someone who is scared of what you're offering. Understanding that they're not detached because they don't feel, but because they feel too much and don't know how to handle it, can be a turning point. For them to heal, they need to learn how to sit with closeness without running. And for you, that often means stepping back, not to punish them, but to protect your peace. No contact removes the emotional safety net they've relied on. You. For someone with an avoidant attachment style, relationships often operate on a subconscious assumption. You'll keep showing up no matter how distant I become. They learn to trust your presence, not because they engage with it openly, but because they depend on the certainty that you're always there. Emotionally available, initiating connection, doing the work of holding the relationship together. This dynamic becomes the invisible scaffolding they lean on, even while they act like they don't need it. When you decide to go no contact, especially after repeated patterns of hot and cold behavior, it's not just about creating space. It's about withdrawing that emotional anchor. The messages, the check-ins, the small ways you use to remind them that you're still there, even when they're emotionally unavailable. All of that disappears. And for the first time, they're left alone with their own emotional landscape, without the buffer of your constant reassurance. This absence creates a very specific kind of discomfort for an avoidant. They're used to managing relationships on their terms, coming close when they feel safe, pulling away when things get intense, and trusting that the other person will remain steady regardless of their inconsistency. But when you go quiet, you disrupt that rhythm. The reliability of your emotional presence, the thing they pretended not to need, suddenly goes missing. And it stirs up anxiety they're not used to feeling in this way. Here's the paradox. Avoidance often feels safest when they're in control of the emotional distance. But when you stop reaching out, they're no longer the one creating space. You are. This shift throws off the entire dynamic. They can no longer rely on you to cushion the fallout of their detachment. Now, instead of having the upper hand, they're left wondering what your silence means. Are you done? Are you moving on? Did they miscalculate your patience? The withdrawal of your emotional labor forces them into a position they typically avoid, emotional responsibility, when you were initiating, reassuring, and stabilizing the relationship. They didn't have to face their fears. They could remain emotionally passive while still benefiting from connection. But now, if they want connection again, they'd have to do something that scares them, initiate vulnerability. They'd have to come forward instead of waiting for you to reach back. This is why no contact isn't about punishment or manipulation. It's about refusing to play a role in a dynamic that leaves you emotionally drained. By stepping away, you remove the quiet support system they've taken for granted. And while this can be deeply uncomfortable for them, it's often the catalyst that brings hidden emotions to the surface. It's in your absence that they finally have to reckon with what your presence truly meant. When the emotional safety net disappears, they can no longer lean on it without acknowledging its value. That recognition, while often delayed, is powerful. Because for someone who's always feared closeness, losing it might be the first time they understand what it really meant. The silence acts as a mirror, forcing them to confront feelings they usually run from. For someone with an avoidant attachment style, emotional distance is not just a coping mechanism, it's a survival strategy. When emotions get intense, their instinct is to detach. Instead of leaning into connection, they retreat into themselves. They busy their minds, distract themselves with work, hobbies, or surface-level interactions. This isn't just because they're trying to forget about you, it's because they're trying to avoid the emotional weight that closeness can stir in them. But when you go no contact and that usual line of communication disappears, it creates an unfamiliar kind of silence, one they can't easily escape or drown out. That quiet isn't just about you being gone. It creates a void. A void where your texts, check-ins, and emotional presence used to live. And that void starts to echo back everything they've been avoiding. The confusion, the unresolved feelings, the guilt, and most importantly, the fear. You see, while they've been emotionally distant, they've still been leaning on the energy you provide. Your availability acts like a cushion. It allows them to keep one foot in the relationship without confronting what's truly going on inside them. But when that cushion is pulled away, when the messages stop, when the silence lingers, they're left with only themselves. And that's exactly what triggers something deep. That silence becomes a mirror. It reflects the inner conflict they've been avoiding all along. Without your reassurance, they are left to question, did I push them too far? Why does this feel uncomfortable if I wanted space? Why can't I stop thinking about them? These are questions they don't typically allow themselves to ask because emotional self-inquiry threatens the emotional distance they rely on. But your silence makes it unavoidable. Avoidants are rarely challenged to sit in emotional discomfort because most people around them end up over-functioning in relationships, doing the emotional work, bridging the gap, and chasing them for answers or closure. That pursuit allows avoidants to stay numb, disengaged, and in control. But the moment you stop chasing, the emotional responsibility bounces back to them. And for many, it's the first time they've felt the weight of that. They may not show this externally. On the surface, they might still appear calm, detached, or unbothered. But the mirror of silence doesn't reflect on the outside, it works internally. It stirs up the emotions they buried beneath logic, independence, and rationalization. This often leads to confusion or internal conflict. They don't understand why they're thinking about you more now than when you were available. They may even feel anger, not because you've done something wrong, but because the silence has disrupted their emotional numbing process. And that's the power of no contact, not as a tactic to manipulate, but as a space that reveals. It brings their unresolved fears to the surface. It reflects back the emotional reality they've spent so long avoiding, not because you've said something, but because you've finally stopped saying anything at all. Your absence becomes more powerful than your presence when they realize what's missing. For someone with an avoidant attachment style, your consistent emotional presence often goes unnoticed, not because they don't value it, but because they assume it will always be there. They become accustomed to your reassurance, your efforts to connect, your willingness to bridge the emotional distance. In a way, your presence becomes background noise, comforting, familiar, and constant. But the moment you withdraw, the silence you leave behind becomes louder than any words you ever said. When you're constantly available, it's easy for an avoidant to take that presence for granted. They may not fully process the emotional investment you're making because their default setting is to stay one step removed from deep emotional engagement. They don't intentionally ignore your efforts. Instead, they avoid leaning into them because closeness feels threatening. It's like they have emotional blinders on. They know you care, but they keep themselves just far enough away so they don't have to confront what that truly means. But when you step back, everything changes. Your absence creates a noticeable shift in the emotional atmosphere. What was once predictable and secure now feels uncertain and empty. And that absence creates contrast. Suddenly, they're not comparing you to other people. They're comparing you to the silence. And silence, for the first time, feels worse than the closeness they were avoiding. Avoidants typically manage their emotions by suppressing them, by creating mental narratives that justify pulling away. I just need space. I'm better off alone. It wasn't really that serious. These are stories they tell themselves to avoid vulnerability. But those narratives begin to unravel when you're no longer there to react to them. When you don't argue, explain, or try to fix things, they left with nothing but their own thoughts. And those thoughts can become unexpectedly loud. Suddenly, they're replaying moments. They're remembering your presence, not as pressure, but as peace. They might recall your support, your emotional availability, the way you made them feel seen without forcing anything. All of that starts to take on new meaning in your absence, because now they don't just miss you, they start to see you clearly, sometimes for the first time. This is the emotional shift no contact can create, not because you vanished to make a point, but because in choosing yourself, you highlighted your worth. You gave them a chance to experience life without the emotional foundation you quietly provided. And for many avoidants, it's not until that foundation is gone that they understand how much they were standing on it. Your presence may have been soft, steady, and subtle, but your absence becomes a wake-up call. It forces reflection and sometimes even regret. Not because you tried to prove your value, but because your distance revealed it. That's when they realize the space you once occupied wasn't just filled by anyone, it was uniquely, unmistakably you. And now that space feels emptier than they ever expected. No contact isn't manipulation, it's self-respect and the beginning of clarity. In the middle of heartbreak or emotional confusion, it's easy to feel like going silent is an act of punishment or some kind of emotional chess move. But the truth is far more grounded and empowering. Stepping back from someone who continuously pulls away is not about trying to control the outcome. It's about finally releasing what you can't control and choosing yourself instead. When someone has an avoidant attachment style, they often operate in a cycle of pulling close just enough to maintain the connection, then distancing themselves the moment they start to feel emotionally exposed. This can leave the other person, typically someone more emotionally available, stuck in a confusing pattern of chasing, proving, and waiting. Over time, this dynamic erodes your self-worth. You begin questioning if you're asking for too much, when really you're just asking for consistency, presence, and emotional honesty. No contact is a boundary, not a tactic. It's a declaration that you are no longer willing to invest in a connection that isn't reciprocal. It says, I love you enough to let you go, and I love myself enough not to abandon my own emotional needs. And that's not manipulation, that's maturity. It's a refusal to continue pouring energy into a one-sided emotional economy. The clarity begins when the noise stops. When you stop texting, calling, explaining, and over-functioning in the relationship, space opens up for both of you. For the avoidant, that space creates discomfort and possibly even recognition. For you, it creates perspective. You begin to see the dynamic for what it was, not through the lens of hope or longing, but with a clearer understanding of how much you were carrying. You start to feel what it's like to return to yourself, to stop waiting, to breathe without bracing for emotional rejection. One of the most misunderstood parts of no contact is the idea that it's about trying to get them back. But real no contact, the kind that comes from a place of growth, isn't about that at all. It's about breaking the cycle. It's about removing yourself from a pattern that kept you small, uncertain, or dependent on crumbs of connection. It's giving yourself the gift of peace, even if that peace initially feels empty or painful. In doing so, you actually shift the entire emotional balance. The avoidant, who once felt in control by holding their emotions at arm's length, now has to sit with the weight of what's been lost. But whether or not they come back isn't the point. The point is that you stopped abandoning yourself for someone else's comfort. That act alone is transformative. True clarity doesn't always come from conversation. It often comes from silence. And sometimes the most powerful thing you can do for your healing, your dignity, and your future is to stop showing up where you are not met and let the distance speak what words never could. So, to sum it all up, no contact isn't about winning or losing, and it's definitely not about punishment. It's about creating the space for both people, especially the avoidant, to face what's really going on beneath the surface. Your silence isn't emptiness. It's a powerful mirror that reflects fears, feelings, and truths that words often can't reach. By stepping back, you're not only protecting your own heart, but you're also giving them the chance to confront their own vulnerabilities, which is the first step toward real change. Remember, the most important relationship you have is the one with yourself. Setting boundaries, choosing your peace, and honoring your worth is the greatest gift you can give to yourself and to those around you. If someone truly values you, they'll rise to meet you. If not, your absence will reveal what your presence never could. Thank you so much for listening and being open to this conversation. I hope this has given you some clarity and courage on your journey. Remember, sometimes the loudest message we can send is through silence. And sometimes the strongest love is self-love. Take care of yourself, and I wish you all the strength and clarity you need moving forward. Goodbye for now, and thank you again for sharing this time with me.